Hello, this is David Scheinbaum. This presentation is meant to go with today's blog, which is August 21st, 2020. And as I wrote in the blog, this is purely experimental. We're going to try to put this talk up here in lieu of posting a video. I'm going to try to not make it academic. I'm going to work without notes. I'm just going to kind of make it conversational, talk my way through it, and see if this becomes a viable way to do presentations. I'd like to avoid Zoom if we can, and maybe make our presentations a little more related to the blogs that we're writing each week. So we're going to need you to let us know. Hopefully you could give us a little critique and send us an email if you think this works, and we'll go from there. There's many approaches to portraiture, and of course O'Keeffe was the subject of so many photographers, and she's kind of an icon here in New Mexico, and there's so much mystery around her that these photographs are kind of what so many people gravitate to. The most traditional approach in portraiture, we would say, would be by Joseph Karsh. He's kind of the Rembrandt of photography. His work is technically perfect. The prints are beautiful. They're very dramatic. The lighting is actually right out of a Rembrandt painting. And, when we look at his portraiture, we're seeing basically the likeness and hopefully the personality of the subject. It's a very direct approach using a large format camera. The portrait of O'Keeffe, 1956, in a way typifies Karsh's approach. You could see there's a use of natural lights. He's sitting by the doorway. But, with his other subjects, like this next image, Winston Churchill, you could see again, there's a rapport between the subject and the photographer, but, we would say it's posed. He has all to do with directing his subject as he's taking the picture in terms of how they should sit, how they should look, what kind of expression should be on their face. So in a way, when we're talking about portraiture and photography, this, could just be a definition of what we might call direct portraiture. Another image of Hemingway. And again, you could see stylistically between the O'Keeffe and the Churchill and this Hemingway, kind of how Karsh works. They're beautiful images. They're, technically perfect in every way, and they're capturing the person. Another way to photograph is typified by the photographer Arnold Newman. What Arnold Newman pioneered was an approach to portraiture photography that we call environmental portraiture. So, we're not only seeing what a person looks like, but what Arnold Newman does is he's putting information in the frame that's telling us about the person. So, here's what they look like, but there's information here what they do. So if you don't know who Mondrian was, you could see just by the easel and such that he was a painter. And actually, if you're aware of Mondrian's work, the composition itself mimics what Mondrian did in his compositions and the subject matter. So Newman's trying to tell us more than what a person looks like, more than a mere, reflection of that person, but he's filling the frame or using the environment to enlighten us as a viewer with kind of hints. Stravinsky, of course, again, if you didn't know who Stravinsky was, you would know right away by this portrait that he was a musician. But, using a dynamic, very dynamic composition, we're meeting Stravinsky, we're learning about him within the frame, and we have this incredible dynamic composition as well. So this, it again would be a visual definition of Arnold Newman's way, which again we call environmental portraiture. And here's his portrait of O'Keeffe, where he's actually putting O'Keeffe right on her canvas. So she's a painting of herself, if you will. And again, if you know about O'Keeffe, which most of you do, this has it all. It has the New Mexico landscape, it has the skull and the bones that she went to so often in her subject matter, and there she is herself. So we know she's a painter, we know she lives in New Mexico, we know possibly the kind of things that she does in her painting. So the environmental portrait, of course, is kind of a little detective game sometimes, especially if you don't know who that subject is. So Alfred Stieglitz, again, I've written so much about him already in our various blogs. But for right now, let's just talk about, his portraits of O'Keeffe. So, O'Keeffe was his muse. He went and photographed her again and again and again. There are hundreds, literally hundreds of portraits of O'Keeffe. And it's interesting in reading correspondence and learning about Stieglitz and his approach, and reading some of the things that O'Keeffe has written. I could tell you that O'Keeffe felt that these photographs were collaborative. She felt that, she was always in control, that she was aware of who she was at any given moment in front of his camera. And, she took on that characterization, or she took on that persona. So she saw them as collaborative. Stieglitz's approach to portraiture or photography is kind of unique, and there's a lot for us to learn from this. He felt that no one picture, no one photograph can capture the personality of someone. That human beings, we, are much more complex than being able to be captured with one pose or one orientation. And his approach to portraiture, and he's not written too much about this, but he has written about it. He preferred, a way that it's kind of an accumulation of portraits, or what we would call composite portraiture. He felt that all of his portraits of O'Keeffe equaled a portrait of O'Keeffe, and no one photograph that he made of her captured her essence completely. So this is a very different approach, and you don't hear very many photographers talk about this idea of composite portraiture. And truth is, not many other photographers picked up on this approach. I'll talk more about that in a minute, but let's look at one or two of these O'Keeffe portraits by Stieglitz. But again, let's look at them with the understanding that as much as each one stands on its own, that they're all meant to equal a portrait. And it's almost requires a different way of looking as well. So here we go. So, you get the idea that, he's working with different aspects of her body, different times of day, different dress, different posing. And again, there's hundreds of his portraits. And again, we're going to call this composite portraiture. By the way, these are some of, bear none, they're some of the most beautiful, beautiful portraits in photographic history. Many of the prints are platinum prints. these, if you have an opportunity to see some of these portraits in person, it will be an incredibly rewarding experience. Those of you here in Santa Fe, of course, the Judge O'Keefe Museum has a pretty good offering of them, and they put them on display periodically. So moving on, and I said earlier that not many photographers picked up on this approach, but one that did was photographer Harry Callahan. Those of you who are familiar with Callahan's work might know that his wife, Eleanor, was his muse, and he felt a similar way, that no one photograph of her captured her completely, and he trained his camera on her time and time and time again over the years to complete this kind of composite portrait. And again, we'll see, not only images of herself, but more abstract approaches, details of her, different dress, different times of day, different exposures even. But again, trying to look at them with the understanding that these are all going to equal, a complete portrait of Eleanor. These two are very beautiful if you ever have an opportunity to see a group of Harry Callahan's Eleanor photographs. It's also remarkably rewarding. And when you see them all together in a gallery, the statement that this is a portrait and meant to add up to a portrait is very, very clear. But again, not to diminish the individual beauty and the individual success of every single one. So, there's a little trivia, a little photo history. And, Beaumont always talked about serendipity and the way things happen. And it's always fun to try to trace some of these stories back. And it will also give us some insight into um, how Callahan got on to photographing in this way and his friendship with Todd Webb. So, kind of very quickly, both Todd Webb and Harry Callahan worked for the Ford Motor Company in Detroit. They kind of worked on the assembly line, but there was also a camera club, the Detroit Camera Club. And they were good friends. They were both interested in photography. And what the camera club did is they chipped in to bring Ansel Adams out to give a week-long workshop on photography for the Detroit Camera Club. The way Todd used to tell this story was that, by the second day, just he and Harry were the only two students left. And I think it started with 10 or 12, that Ansel was just too serious for everyone. And especially when they started talking about the darkroom. And it was really only Todd and Harry that had the passion and the interest in what Ansel was teaching. So they ended up having kind of this private week with Ansel Adams, learning his technique. And, basically at the time for them, as it turned out, Harry was already married with Eleanor, and the three of them ended up leaving Detroit and moving to New York together. And they shared an apartment in Manhattan, and they went, about getting jobs and doing their work. But at that time, Todd Webb went to meet Alfred Stieglitz. I just put up this Arnold Newman slide of O'Keeffe and Stieglitz because it's beautiful, and I like looking at this image. It doesn't so fit into the story. But Todd ended up becoming kind of a protege and helping Stieglitz at his gallery. Stieglitz gave him some jobs when he could. Todd did some reproduction photographs for him, meaning photographing other artwork, whether it be painting or sculpture. And he kind of encouraged Todd to, go out and photograph. One project Todd did at that time was, photographing the city in New York. Not in the same way that, Bernice Abbott was looking at the city, but to actually go through the city and make the beautiful city photographs that Todd Webb did. But it was through Todd's friendship with Stieglitz and O'Keeffe, that led to Todd's long relationship with both of them. Of course, he'd go back and share, all his learnings with Harry Callahan, and so, the idea of Callahan making all those Eleanor photographs, working kind of within a vein of Stieglitz, it all kind of filters through. This is Todd's Stieglitz portrait of 46, and a few of Todd's New York images. And again, this was kind of a project that Stieglitz was mentoring. Todd would, bring back images on a regular basis for Stieglitz to critique and talk about, and it really kind of was private tutorials by these two great photographers. So when Todd and his wife Lucille come out to New Mexico at Judge O'Keeffe's invitation, and again, in today's blog, I write about, they're opening a bookstore on Canyon Road and such, but it should be no surprise, especially at this point, that Todd, with George O'Keeffe's cooperation, begins a photographic project photographing O'Keeffe in this same composite portraiture approach. And for years, he photographed O'Keeffe in the landscape, in her studio, at work, at rest, at play. And, this body of work exists as a beautiful volume on George O'Keeffe. But again, when we look at this, portrait of O'Keeffe walking in the White Place, as well as kind of a still life of Todd, photographing the skull, this is all part of what should be understood as a composite portrait of a person. And again, learning from Stieglitz himself, O'Keeffe already having the experience of collaborating in this kind of portraiture, you could see how willing and comfortable that she is in front of Todd's camera. And this is interesting. This is O'Keeffe's studio in 1962 in black and white, of course. And there's this studio image in color, and it takes on a very different character. What I like to comment about in this photograph is, today's blog that I wrote up on, which is on our website, is all about George O'Keeffe's power of interpretation and what a great interpreter she was of her subject matter. And, looking at the painting on the wall on the right, many people read that as a river, a river kind of coming down through a canyon or whatever. So just to be able to look what O'Keeffe is looking at and making that painting, that branch on the left, there it is. I mean, this one image explains my whole point of today's blog, that learning about interpretation in art, which is particularly hard for photographers for some reason, but learning about how to really transform your subject matter in a way that Minor White would say that the camera records superbly but transforms better. Look at the transformation of that twig into that painting. I mean, that's the power of where a lot of the keys to art making are hidden. The idea of making subject matter your own. But again, just hammer away at that. All these pictures together are giving us this portrait of O'Keeffe. These Glen Canyon images, this is for another day. But, these Glen Canyon trips were kind of organized by Elliott Porter. Those of you who are familiar with his book, The Place No One Knew. But when Elliott would go into the Glen Canyon to photograph, a number of people would often join him. So sometimes his sons, O'Keeffe went along, and in this case, Todd Webb joined them. So you have to imagine that, like this one Glen Canyon image is, there's a whole group of these friends who are traveling down the canyon together, sketching, photographing, just looking and being there. There's a whole wonderful history in these Elliott Porter's Glen Canyon trips. But Todd's work of O'Keeffe, I think, is, really one of the best, full picture of O'Keeffe, her environment, her life, her personality. It's, this kind of stern portrait is an image, we see most by many photographers. But if you think back for a few slides of her pouring tea or stirring the pot in the kitchen, there's not many images that she really let herself be herself in front of the camera where she's not putting on a pose, so to speak. So another photographer that we've been very lucky to work with and know is a photographer named Myron Wood. This is a portrait of Roy Stryker, and again, this might be for another day, but Roy Stryker led the FSA, the Farm Security Administration, which turned out to be a major photo documentation of America at the time of what we might call the Dust Bowl pictures and the whole move west, where families were picking up and just heading west to seek their fortune. So if you know those images of Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans and Russell Lee and Marion Post Walcott, Roy Stryker single-handedly put together this team of photographers to do this photo documentation on what was happening in America at the time. The reason his slide is up here is because Roy Stryker ended up retiring to Colorado Springs. And a photographer in Colorado Springs named Myron Wood befriended Roy Stryker, and Roy Stryker kind of mentored Myron on photographing, kind of doing a little mini documentation on northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. So Myron spent years photographing this area, and Roy Stryker helped him in many ways. Again, if you think of the Todd Webb's New York work and having Stieglitz there to talk with him and critique his work, let's put Stryker in that same position for Myron. He was a friend and a mentor to him. In this case, with the O'Keeffe photographs by Myron, Myron's daughter was a companion to O'Keeffe and helped her in many, many ways. And it was through his daughter's working with and friendship with O'Keeffe that Myron was permitted to come and photograph. And again, Myron took, all of his knowledge, all of his background, all of his teachings, and again, put together a body of work in this kind of composite portraiture way to, again, he produced a beautiful book entitled Miss O'Keeffe. And here's an opportunity to see some of, his approach to photographing O'Keeffe and her world. They're a little more environmental. There are portraits included in his work, but not as many as Todd. He wasn't necessarily like a good friend of O'Keeffe, but he was certainly someone that she invited and permitted to come in and photograph her world. But, on one hand, he's approaching her environment almost as similar to some compositions of her paintings. Those of you who are familiar with, O'Keeffe's Black Door paintings, we see Myron, of course, gravitating to that black door and showing us, the quote, reality of how that subject existed in her environment. What's interesting is Myron also gives us, in a way, a closer look at the interior of her home. And within Myron's work, there are these beautiful, I'll call them still lifes that he made of not only the nooks and crannies, but her stones, her little arrangements. Again, it tells us so much about O'Keeffe and her life and how important her environment was, and also how related her environment was to her artwork. Now, as we move on, I mentioned Elliott and the Glen Canyon trips, and Elliott exhibited at an American place and was also a friend of both Stieglitz and O'Keeffe from New York. And when Elliott and his wife Eileen came out to New Mexico, they already had a friendship that they continued and rekindled, so to speak, both living here. And O'Keeffe and Elliott would go out quite often, not just to Glen Canyon, but O'Keeffe shared with Elliott some of the places that she loved, the Black Place, the White Place, which are areas in and around the Abiquiu Ghost Ranch area of New Mexico. The confluence here, the Chama River image, is basically right down the road from Abiquiu, and I'm not certain, but typically, you know, he had to be up there visiting probably O'Keeffe and made this image either before or after, because it's not very far from her house. And this particular picture, photographers don't like to say what their favorites are, but a print of this image hung over Elliott's desk in his studio for all the years that Janet and I knew him. So we know that this particular image of the Chama River is a very important photograph to Elliott. This portrait, this is a bust being sculpted by Mary Callery and O'Keeffe posing for it. And this was done at the Ghost Ranch house, not the Abiquiu house. And I mentioned O'Keeffe's loved painting at both the Black Place, which is kind of near an area in New Mexico, Cuba, New Mexico. It's kind of in that environment on the other side of the mountains from Abiquiu, or the White Place, which is pretty much in Abiquiu, where these beautiful, actually, I put some images of the White Place in today's blog, if you access that. But I wouldn't say that Elliott, photographed O'Keeffe as much as he photographed with O'Keeffe. O'Keeffe would paint, he would photograph, and they would go out together. And an image like this, where Elliott might have seen something in her home, had an opportunity to make an image. I'll end this with this great image and this funny story. It's kind of written here. We've lost John Lowengar just a few months ago. He passed. But during the Glen Canyon trips, whoever was on those trips, there was a kind of an evening activity. There was a tradition during the day that, regardless of what everyone was doing on, these were rafting trips, down the Glen Canyon, people would collect what they always felt was the most beautiful stone. And every evening after the dinner, kind of sitting around the campfire, people would reveal the stone for the day, and it would be voted or decided by everybody who had the most beautiful stone. And after one of these trips, it was clear that Elliott had the most beautiful stone, and O'Keeffe wanted it, and Elliott wouldn't give it to her. And, the rest of the story is written here. Elliott and Aline had O'Keeffe for Thanksgiving dinner, and they purposely left the stone out on the coffee table, knowing very well that sometime during the night, O'Keeffe would steal it. And she did. And as it says right here under this slide, Elliott hadn't seen that again until he saw the John Lowengar photograph, where basically O'Keeffe admits to this. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. I don't know if this is a good way to present information. I hope you'll write to us and let us know your thoughts with some critique, some suggestions. But, it's for me, talking to a screen. I'm not sure. So thanks for listening. Please stay safe. Please stay well. And we'll check in with you all again next week. Bye.